1 Samuel 16, 1 through 13. Now the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go, and I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself among his sons." Now we see how a few chapters ago Saul was appointed as king. We see in the chapter earlier how Saul disobeys and God's done with him being king, even though we see David don't reign for, I believe, another 40 years. He finally becomes king. But we see how God's moved on. Sometimes leadership's okay at the beginning and then it's bad, and then God's just done with it and preparing the next person while we're still focused on them. Now, Samuel was a representative of God, because we see at times in the Old Testament, how there's usually one prophet per area. So Samuel was just the prophet at this time. There's no other prophets of God. So the word only came through Samuel. So this was showing that God was already choosing the next leader. As long as things are continuing to go, God's already moving about to the next things. But Samuel said, "How can I go? When Saul hears of it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. You shall invite Jesse to sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one whom I designate to you." Now it's interesting, because at this time we have priests, and they did sacrifices. Samuel's at this time one of the few, because he's a prophet of God. He's not a Levite, although he's brought up in the temple. So we see how even though sacrifices were regulated to Levites, we see in a way that it isn't just though it ain't like everybody can't give sacrifice to the Lord as a form of worship. So he's concerned about his well-being because Saul is king. We see in times of history how kings often killed people because they were threatened. We see with Herod in the New Testament how he ended up killing a lot of people. In counting the New Testament, we see how he kills babies. But we see historically, it's known that he killed his own sons because he didn't want them to take over. We see how David later deals with his sons one of his sons trying to take his throne. So it's a common thing for the king to be threatened. So Samuel did what the Lord said and came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city came trembling to meet him and said, "Do you come in peace?" He said, "In peace I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." He also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So the reason why they're freaking out is most of the time prophets came not to bring good word, not to bring good news. Most of the time it's words of warning rather than good news brought. We see often, because we're more prone to need correction than being told that we're doing what we need to be doing. Because oftentimes we're not doing what we need to be doing. And so we see more in the Bible of the prophets telling people, you shouldn't be doing this. This is what God wants for you, rather than bringing good news. When they entered, he looked at Eliab, and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." It's important to note here that Saul was tall. He was physically gifted compared to people of those days. He was much larger. In the eyes of man, Saul made a great king. And his heart was there in the beginning, but he got overwhelmed with his own power and everything and followed his path rather than the Lord's and became a bad king. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at his height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel and said to him, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Next Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." We see in the next chapter with Goliath's challenge that these three men appear again. David's going to bring them a meal, and David notices Goliath blaspheming, and he's questioning his brothers why they just let him do that. So we see that there wouldn't have been a good choice by a king because they have fear. They don't have strong enough faith. But we see how David proves himself, shows that his faith is stronger than his fear when he goes to battle. And we see how, although Samuel didn't see it, God did see what was in David. Thus Jesse made 7 sons of his pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Are these all the children?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is tending the sheep." Then Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes." It's for the Jewish people, the heir was a very important thing. So oftentimes the oldest was the one selected. But we see time and time in the Old Testament how it wasn't the oldest selected. We see how Jacob was selected over Esau. We see how Joseph inherited a double portion because Reuben defiled his father's house. We see how all this, where the heir wasn't as important to God, but who the man was. What is important to man and what man sees in a person isn't what God sees. God doesn't see who we are. He sees more of through Him who we're going to become. And there's some people, God knew that Saul was going to start rebelling against them. God also knew that David at the time wouldn't have been anointed as king because he was too young at the time. He was probably an infant. But we see how God knew what He was doing. We see how later Saul's line's pretty much cut off. But David's line goes through Christ. So he sent and brought him in, and he was ruddy with beautiful eyes and handsome appearance. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." So this part's important because usually kings would lead their army into battle. So we see here, based on his description, he wasn't no soldier, he wasn't no fighter. And so this would have been something that the people would have questioned himself until the next chapter where he killed the mightiest warrior of the Philistines, at which point they know, okay, he may not be a great warrior, but the Lord's behind him, so he's doing what he needs to be doing. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward, and Samuel rose and went to Ramah. So we see how the anointing. Today we do laying on the hands, we do anointing for those that are called by God to whatever they do. And it ain't necessarily for us to agree with their call. If God's leading them, God was leading David to be king. Samuel didn't necessarily see it because we see how he's suggesting this one and this one. But he obeys God's direction. The three mentioned here would have been not a very good king. They probably would have surrendered to the Philistines, let them have the kingdom, and Israel would have been no more. But David ended up causing peace in the kingdom after his many battles to where Solomon didn't even have to fight. It's because he followed the Lord and had a heart for the Lord. Now he wasn't perfect, and God knows we ain't gonna be perfect, so he ain't gonna. But he calls us because we have a heart to Him and to follow Him.